Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I tend to agree, depending on how the amendment would be structured, I tend to agree that the pardon power is something that belongs in the hands of maybe one individual like the president. If you devolved it to some kind of committee or try to put rules and restrictions on how the president used the clemency power, I think you would just get it bogged down. I mean, it's the kind of thing that requires one person to look at the record of the case and make a judgment call about whether some kind of commutation or pardon is warranted in each individual case. It's a hard kind of thing to bureaucratize, if I can put it that way. But Monet, let me throw you this one idea, which is maybe the most intriguing idea that I've heard so far raised in this constitutional debate on the Volokh Conspiracy Law blog over at Reason Magazine, and it's to ban lame duck pardons. That would be a pretty narrow constitutional amendment. It would say that the power to grant reprieves and pardons may not be exercised from 1 month prior to the time of the choosing of the presidential electors until the next presidential term begins. So basically, a president would still have unrestrained pardon authority, just would not be able to exercise it from about the beginning of October until January 20th. And there is a certain amount of logic to that. We still have a pretty long period of presidential transition, even in an age where ballots can be counted pretty quickly and winning candidates can make their way to Washington fast and make their appointments fast. We still have this pretty long lame duck period in American politics. And there is something that makes sense to me about leaving the pardon power in the hands of the president broadly, but requiring it to be exercised at a time when the voters can make their judgments known and hold the occupant of the Oval Office politically accountable. That is what is so difficult, I think, about the current situation, is because as bad as Democrats and President Biden fared in the recent 2024 November election, if he had pardoned his son Hunter before the voting in November, you can only imagine that that would have affected some people's judgments on election day in the ballot box.
Right. I think that there's a huge swirl of reform proposals for the presidential pardon power, in part because of President Biden's decision to pardon Hunter, despite claiming repeatedly that he wouldn't, but then also because of President Trump suggesting that he's about to issue pardons for more than 1,000 convicted January 6th rioters, much to the consternation of the left. And so you see this rare moment of bipartisan interest in restricting this power. I definitely do think that some of the proposals hold merit. I have to say, first of all, that Bill changed my mind live on the podcast a moment ago. Previous to this conversation that we're having now, I would have supported one idea, which was to restrict the president from being able to pardon family members. And that's something that a lot of conservatives have proposed in the wake of the Hunter pardon. But I do think that the freedom afforded to the president to be able to make those decisions should grant him the ability to pardon a family member who might have been unfairly convicted, or there might be under extenuating circumstances that only he is aware of. And that is a power that the American people confer on the president to execute at his discretion. So I do think that President Biden had reasons not to pardon Hunter, but I don't think that we should deprive him of the power to do so. I do think that there are some of the reforms that are still promising, and the lame duck limitation is one of them. I do think that the president should have to be held accountable, or his party, in the case of a president who is not seeking re-election, should be held accountable for the decisions they make to pardon people. So I want to limit it to circumstances where the American people will be able to weigh in relatively quickly if they do think that the president has abused that power. And the other reform that I would endorse is making sure that pardons are restricted to specific crimes rather than blanket. I think that it doesn't make sense to have a president saying that any crimes that this person may have committed without specifying what those crimes are forgiven. They should have to say that this particular offense is being wiped out. And same thing for preemptive pardons. I don't think that it makes sense to have presidents be able to confer immunity on people for crimes that they haven't committed and give them carte blanche to go off and do something horrible that they otherwise might have been prevented from doing. But I do still think that the freedom of the president to be able to make these decisions is an important one. Throughout the history of this country, we were probably restrained by our norms in the ways that presidents chose to execute or not execute this power. And unfortunately, we're in a political position where these norms have degraded. And so we have to think a lot more proactively about the possibility of limiting them because they're no longer limiting themselves. But I do still think that we shouldn't go too far. And should still see the value in affording the president the power to make these kinds of decisions.
Thank you, Monet and Bill. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.